Hey everyone, welcome to our Queer Kidlit debut panel. I'm so excited for this panel. I've loved this idea ever since it landed in my email inbox. I loved the TBR and I've loved making the questions. It's just been like a giant love fest, honestly, on my end. So I'm so excited for this panel and I would love to get started. So, just to start it off, I'm going to introduce myself, have a little bit of housekeeping, and then the authors will introduce themselves. And then we will start with the chat. If you have any questions during the chat, then please leave them in the I was going to say description box, but please leave them in the chat and I will remember to go back to them during the course of our conversation and then we can answer them at the end. So, just a rundown. Oh, I'll first start off with housekeeping actually. So, my one piece of housekeeping is that here we are trying to facilitate a safe space and we don't tolerate any harassment of any kind on our safe space panels and just in general, but like definitely need to mention it. Um, in terms of introductions, I will start. And so my name's Lily. I'm the book person behind Utopia State of Mind on the internet. And that's all. Oh, and I'm moderating this panel. That's all. That's all you really need to know. So now I'm going to have the authors introduce themselves, tell us about their books, and then we'll chat. So Ronnie, do you want to start?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ronnie Riley, and I wrote Jude Saves the World. It's a book about a non binary character who creates a safe space for a local library. Is there anything else you wanted me to add? Nope.
Hi, I'm Justine Pacella Winans, pronouns they, she. My YA debut, Bianca Torre is Afraid of Everything, is a comedic murder mystery about a non binary lesbian birder who accidentally witnesses their neighbor's murder.
My name is Jen St. Jude. I am the author of If Tomorrow Doesn't Come. This is my copy, why it's so beat up, but it's out in May from Bloomsbury and Penguin Random House UK as well.
Hi, my name is Caroline Huntoon. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the author of Skating on Mars, which is a middle grade contemporary story about a non-binary figure skater who is dealing with the recent death of their father and the way that gender impacts the sport that they love.
And hi, I'm Kate Fessner. I'm the author of The Song of Us, which is a queer middle grade novel in verse based on the Greek myth Orpheus and Eurydice, starring two seventh grade girls who are destined to learn to love themselves as they love and lose each other forever. And I'm so excited to be here.
So my first question, I wanted to start off basically by just talking about like the theme of our panel and why we are all here today. So the theme of today's panel is queer kidlit, and I wanted to know kind of how have you experienced the changing landscape of queer kidlit as an aspiring writer all the way to a debut author now, or even if you want to go all the way back as a reader, just like how have you experienced these like changing landscapes of queer kidlit? Ronnie, do you want to start?
Yeah, so growing up as somebody from a really, really small town, I don't feel like queer kidlit, sorry, really existed for me, and I wasn't really aware of it at the time. But I do think it's really beautiful that in the last few years, there's been such an increase in queer stories for kids because it's a beautiful part of life and a beautiful part of my life and my identity. And I think books are really important for kids to be able to see themselves in, and also for kids who aren't queer to be able to see the lives of queer kids in a way that they kind of experience, they don't get to experience outside of a book. Um, so when I was originally like starting to write at like the age of 12, I didn't really write anything queer until I like kind of processed it myself. And so to be able to be a debut author now, writing a queer book has been so healing for my soul personally. Yeah.
Kind of with what Ronnie said, I didn't have a lot of access to queer books when I was growing up, and it's just really great to see now that the canon of queer literature in Kidlit isn't limited just to coming out stories or stories that sort of focus on more of the negatives of the queer experience. I think we have a lot more stories about queer joy now, and even queer characters just getting to exist in fantasy and science fiction and sports and mysteries and just a bunch of different genres. So I think that growth is really exciting to see, as well as the inclusion of various queer identities, especially the increase of trans and non-binary books. Even with the upcoming like trans readathon that's going on, and a tons of support, which is very much needed in this current political climate.
Yeah, first of all, I forgot to say what my book was about, which is about a college freshman who's suffering from depression, and finds out that an asteroid is coming and the world might end in 9 days. And so she returns home to reunite with her family, explore a new relationship with her best friend, and figure out how to want to live again. Back to the question though. So yeah, I had no access, or I know that they existed because I've read them now, but I didn't know that queer books existed when I was younger. I also didn't read a lot of YA, I think, until college, and definitely more after as well. Like I got really into YA books later in life, because I do think like the genre or the age group as it exists today wasn't really how it existed back when I was younger. And I think when I started writing books, I also like my book was straight for like 6 years of its existence. Like there wasn't even any queer characters or relationships in it. And it really took me figuring out myself to figure out the character. And I'm so happy that the book exists as it does now. But even like more recently, when in 2020, when I was reading or I was making a list of like trans and non-binary books, and that's how I realized I'm non-binary because I just didn't read enough to like know that there's so many different layers to that identity, and I was reading about other people's experience and like finding myself in them. So I think like I will probably be reading queer kidlit my whole life, and I hope it shows me surprising parts of myself.
I think I'm so lucky to be sort of at the, I'm on this panel. So I already see around me so many people who are doing great things in the queer kidlit space, but there really is sort of this wonderful boom of queer presence in kidlit, which is so exciting to be a part of. And at the same time, as Justine mentioned, we're living in this world that is really polarized. And, when it comes to the timeline of writing, I would say the earliest most recently any of us wrote our books was like 3 years ago. So then to have them coming out at this particular moment, I wrote a book about a trans athlete. I didn't realize when I wrote that book that it would be coming out in this moment of deep polarization within the US. And that's a lot of what the conversation is around trans identity, especially for youth at this exact moment. But I could never have planned for that. So it's just sort of this interesting moment when we're experiencing our books coming out in a world that is talking about this in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think it's a challenging moment for sure. And to me, it's also a reminder of why it's so important that I'm doing this work. I think about my younger self reaching for books that were beautiful and queer and so far out of my league because they were written for like grown-ups, or the very few queer books that I could find because I did grow up in a really progressive area. I had a lot of queer role models in high school, in the school's English department. It was just like full of queer people living happy lives. And that was the first time I realized, oh, I could do that. I could also be happy. But so many of the books were so limiting in what the queer experience could be. And it's a joy to walk into a bookstore now and see the ever growing space that is queer kidlit, and to feel like we're contributing to that feels enormous, and also feels like a good amount of pressure because there's not enough in that space yet. And so feeling this responsibility, like I can't possibly say all the things about the queer experience, but what is a piece that I could add, and what are the pieces that maybe I'm not the person to tell that story, but it's my responsibility to know who is telling that story and to help promote those books as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've enjoyed so much um, is the fact that I feel like when I was growing up, there definitely were these books, but they were super, super like they were like queer coded, but nothing was ever on the page. And I understand that labels are not they're only give as much help as you can like take from them as well. But I think that one of the things that I felt most influential recently is like the grappling with it on the page, even if they're still questioning, it's still a conversation that's being happen or sorry, that's happening. But like it's not something where you have to like, think at night, like, am I reading into this? Like, is this real? Is this really happening? It's much more like an open conversation. I think that's been my favorite thing that I've really been seeing, like more sort of open conversations on the page as well.
And
Um,
as a side note, it usually is happening, by the way. Like, I think that subtext piece, it's just important to know, like, you're not reading into it.
Yeah. I think in a past panel, I was chatting with Rosie Thor, and I think we were both chatting only about just books that we were reading and like, interpreting like the queer codes or like queer coding these characters. Um, I think Rosie's like pet project is the Hunger Games. um, and so yeah, just like things like that, where you're just like going on a deep dive basically after every movie. Um, The next question that I have is kind of in that same vein as what I was talking about, which is what were some early influential queer books in your lives? Justine, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think that while there was still definitely queer content when I was a teenager, it just wasn't necessarily marketed in the way that allowed me to know about it. And a lot of my early exposure to queer fiction was actually through manga and fan fiction. And that's kind of where I got like my first start into it. Um, Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda by Becky Albert Talley did come out like my senior year of high school, I think, or like when I was first going to college and kind of starting to understand my identity. So that book does hold a special place in my heart, as well as I think it was like in 2018 was when I first came out. And some of the books from that year that like really just kept me going forward were Case and Calendars, This Is Kind of an Epic Love Story, and Katrina Leno's Summer of Salt. So all of those books are like very special to me as well.
Yeah, they weren't probably again, I didn't really read queer books until I was like in my 20s at all. And I think like the first ones that I read that I can remember feeling really moved by and connected with was Adam Silvera's More Happy Than Not, which was his debut and is just like one of my absolute favorite books to this day. And Kelly Quinlan's Her Name in the Sky, which was her self-published book that she, I guess, was technically her debut as well. Though she kind of had a double debut, and Late to the Party is great too. But those were the two that like resonated with me the most. And I still like think about all the time. And I think that was like my first introduction into it. And I really like try to read a lot of self-published books too, because I think they're doing a lot of interesting things that maybe aren't like ready for the market of traditional publishing. So I definitely try to read like at least 5 a year. And I feel like there's a lot of really cool queer books that are coming out that way too.
I think your comment, Lily, about sort of that subtext piece and off the page, the two books that come to mind for me are that growing up, I would keep coming back to again and again were Little Women by Louisa May Alcott and the Alana books by Tamora Pierce. Both of them, I think, have interesting things to say about gender. And certainly, I think there's a lot of scholarly work that is looking at Jo in particular in Little Women and thinking about her / their gender in that text. But then also, I think I loved books as a kid where like the girl dresses up to go to war. I was that was always a theme for me. And then I grew up and was like, oh, this is why you're non-binary. And while I don't think that, the Alana books are exploring the idea of a girl dressing up to become a knight because that's the gender you have to be to explore that world, that DNA is very much in the story of Skating on Mars.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this question for the past few days, and the queer books that I was drawn to as a kid were adult books. And again, I was really lucky to have several queer English teachers who were real role models for me. And before I understood that I was queer, I was most drawn to Jeanette Winterson books. So The Passion and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. And then the play Angels in America by Tony Kushner, which we read in high school. I mean, if you want to know why I write sad queer books, here we go. Jeanette Winterson and Tony Kushner will really do it for you. But I was drawn to these narratives about lives that were supposedly on the fringe, and I didn't quite understand why I was so connected to them, but I felt so deeply that there was something in them there. And so I go back to Janet Winterson books nearly every year because she's always doing something that's really interesting and really different and really queer. And it hasn't necessarily influenced the way I think about Kidlit, but certainly about queer stories and how they're told.
For me, I didn't actually read like an on-the-page queer book until I was an adult, pretty like I'm gonna say mid-20s probably. So I'm gonna have to go with Ashley Herring Blake's Ivy Aberdeen's Letter to the World. It just holds such a special place in my heart. It had the biggest impact on me. It was kind of like the first moment that I was like, oh, not only could I really actually write a queer story, but like I could even do it for Kidlit and middle grade, and yeah, it just really opens my eyes and to this whole new like world. And then I started writing Jude not long afterwards, and a lot of it had to do with just being able to see that somebody else had kind of paved the road already. Um, so it wasn't necessarily like an early influential book, but it's the earliest for me.
I I want to go back to something that Jen said, but I first want to also say that when I was thinking about like queer coded books, I was 100% thinking of many like Tamara Pierce characters that I read where I was like, I feel I feel things, but like I don't know if that's real. um but yeah, I think I can. I think the first one I think I read um not like that. Definitely was I think what was it? I think Let's Talk About Love by Claire Kahn. I think that was like one of the first early ones that I read and I love so much. Um, but yeah, I want to know my next question kind of ties a little bit into what Jen was saying, which is what do you think are some conversations that should still be had about queer rep in Kidlit? And um, we're talking a little bit about this juxtaposition between having like these really beautiful stories, but also the things that are happening also in our world, which are kind of pulling and pushing against it. So Jen, do you want to start since I'm using what you said as like a jumping off point?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like we've all said, and I think we all share what I'm about to say. Don't want to speak for everyone, but I mean, I think you just look around and you're like, there's like almost no trans feminine YA books over the past couple of years. I'd say almost no, because there are some terrific ones like Sasha Masha came out recently and a handful of others, but like it's bleak. Like the landscape is so bleak. And then you start to look at, how many queer books feature characters of color by authors of color, like this panel's white, right? And like I'm just very aware of like what the landscape looks like and the ways that we are growing, but like we're so far away from like the reality of what real teens in the world need in Kidlit. And like, I'm very proud of my book and all of our books, and I think they're very crucial to the world. But like, there's just so much more that needs to be said by so many different voices. And like, I think we all share that feeling, and I'll let you all elaborate. But it's just like, it's really frustrating to be like, okay, well, you can, I feel very lucky to be published, but I also know that like my main character is like a white cis character. And there's a lot of sapphic novels, like that now. Yes, they're probably smaller in the like statistically, like compared to like YA as a whole, but probably overrepresented for like what we actually need in Kidlit.
Yeah, I will echo what Jen is saying about how do we make more room at the table instead of feeling like we're competing for the seats at the table. And that relates to Queerlit, but honestly, it relates to sort of the landscape of publishing at large, and a hope for more experiences to be represented. I think early when I wrote my book, there another book came out about a non-binary figure skater right when I was querying, called Anna on the Edge by AJ Sass, and it's a lovely book. It's a different book than my book, but they're both about non-binary figure skaters. And I remember one person saying, "This is a great book, but it's the same concept as this other one." And I feel so grateful that there's space for two, maybe more. But I go back to what Kate said about how can I add one small piece, and I just want to make sure that it's never a checkbox when it comes to these different kinds of books. We've got one that has a sapphic character at the center. We've done it. Great job. Pats on the back all around. There's all kinds of angles and pieces of information and experiences that can be integrated into those books.
Yeah, additionally, I think there has to be more space too, in Kidlit and in general for books that ask questions but don't necessarily have answers. So I think a lot about Corey McCarthy's Man o' War, which came out last year. And I mean, that book destroyed me in the best way. But one of the things that I loved about it so much is it's technically Kidlit, right? It's technically YA, but it does something so few YA books get to do, which is it takes place over many years. And it takes place in a whole adolescence of trying to figure out who this character River is. And I felt so moved by it because I think a lot of times as a Kidlit author, we're kind of told like you get this small period of time, right? Your book takes place over 10 days before an asteroid, or maybe it takes place like, over the course of half a school year. And that's like really big, right? But it takes years to come into who you are. And I think a lot of stories, are asked to be shorter, are asked to condense it, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the real experience. And so one thing I hope for is more stories that allow for that grappling and that questioning space to normalize it. Because I think it's a real experience, and it's okay that a 15-year-old doesn't have all the answers yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo what everybody's been saying, but just, yeah, not having all of the answers, I think, is a really good point that you bring up, Kate, because they're just like, I think that there needs to be more queer Kidlit, just because there are so many nuances to being queer, and then all of the intersectionalities that go with that, like if you're a person of color, if you're disabled, or anything like that. And I think that no one's like one experience can show everything. And non-queer literature, there's like so many characters and genres and settings and plots that these characters get to, or these writers and characters get to explore. And I think in the same vein, we need to have queer representation in all its forms. So like queer heroes and villains and queer people who don't save anything at all. but are just trying to live their life. And I think that's definitely a conversation that should still be had to this day. Yeah.
I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned is I think there needs to be more of an allowance for messy, silly queer characters, especially when it comes to books written by authors of color, but in general as well. I think that there's this idea that every queer book needs to be like super important. And I think that not every sort of life-saving book has to be that same sort of like literary, very like intense kind of read. I think that there can be just like silly rom-coms that are just as life-saving because we're in like such a dark time, especially for trans and non-binary writers and readers, it's nice to have those books to escape into and not have to deal with sort of all of the negative aspects. I also think that in terms of kind of publishing as an industry, it's important not only to keep acquiring books by queer authors of color, as well as more trans femme and trans women authors, but to give those the marketing support that a lot of white queer authors receive, and to keep pushing them and setting them up for longer careers and, you know, a lot of books in the future. And I would also think that, especially like on the publisher side, to talk more about ways to go against these book bans and challenge these bans to better support queer authors and even just you know, authors of color who are not queer, but especially queer authors of color who are facing these banning challenges. I think there is a lot of support from booksellers and librarians, and to see the publishers get more involved would be really great.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that too, like you know, it's all connected, right? It's like we saw yesterday, I think in Florida, they banned any book referencing like reproductive organs for children. Or so it's like if someone gets their period, you can't write about that in a book, or the book is banned, which is just so shocking. And somehow and like it's all tied together. It's just like control of people's bodies, and gender expression is all just really layered. And you know, they're coming for queer kidlit, and it's just going to keep going. Like it really is just a slippery slope, to control like young minds, which is just really sad.
Yeah, I think that I like to ask this question a lot because I think that it's important to celebrate like this, you know, the all of the things that we're seeing, but also to realize that there are still conversations that we should be having because, like, you know, we have so much to do, but also we should still celebrate what we have done at the same time, basically. I want to ask a few questions that are diving a little bit more in depth into the books. So the first question that I have is kind of, now that I'm rereading it, kind of a little bit of a nice segue, unknowingly. And it's but a theme that I really loved both in Skating on Mars and Jude Saves the World is individuals who make a difference, because I think that, you know, kind of whatever other people have been saying and like echoing, you know, all of what we're saying, right? These ideas about not everything having to be these kind of like really big things, right? The individual impact is also really huge. And so both of your main characters are living their lives when their efforts turn out to have an impact. And so I really love this, especially in the middle grade space. Um, and so I wanted to know from both of you if you could talk about what it was like to write about what your main characters are doing, and the balance between individuals and change, and maybe also specifically for like the middle grade um, audience who are, I don't know, I'm not a I'm not a middle grade person anymore, but like, you know, faced with really hard, scary things as well in the world, and maybe feeling a little bit of like a lack of agency, basically. Yeah.
I think a lot of middle grade stories, and certainly the middle grade stories that I tend to write, are often about an individual identifying a want or a need and starting to go after that, and then realizing, like, oh, this affects the wider world in some way, or the wider world impacts my want or need. And then, sort of, the next logical step in that, just story structure wise, is okay, so how do I interact with the wider world around this thing that I want or need? And that's true in a lot of stories, not just queer stories, and certainly a lot of middle grade stories, because uh, middle school students are going through, middle school young people, tweens, whatever you want to call them, are going through this phase where they go from a really myopic view of the world is, the Caroline Huntoon movie. It's so great that you all got cameos in it. Congratulations. But you're not the main character. Main character energy always here. And then throughout those middle school years, those students are realizing, oh, there are other main characters. I might have a co-star, or someone else's story is going on and I'm a part of it in a different way. So I think it makes sense that the stories that we're writing in the middle grade space explore that. Specifically for me, I wanted to make sure that I think one of the things that can be really demoralizing is when, and I think about this in relation to climate change all the time specifically, not to like veer off into a different territory, but the idea that like, well, unless a really big change is made by a really big company, you recycling your plastic cups isn't really going to change much. And that can feel very demoralizing, especially when you're, I was going to say young, but I would say when you're 39, it can feel really demoralizing. So there's a little bit of wish fulfillment always in my writing. I think in everyone's writing, you secretly write some of your wishes in there. But there's a thread of optimism and hope that, yeah, those individuals can change the world around them. And I don't think that the world is fixed or changed, wildly at the end of Skating on Mars. But I do think that Mars makes a step towards making their world work a little better for them.
Yeah, I have to echo a lot of that. I definitely feel like for Jude Saves the World, most people, I think, would agree that when you are starting to write and build characters, you kind of have to mold them and shape them a little bit. And for me, Jude kind of came to me almost fully formed. They just had such a loud voice in my head. They showed me exactly who they were and what they wanted and how they treated others. And I think that a lot of that is, a little bit like who I am or who I aspire to be. And so part of Jude changing the space around them was because that's what Jude needed. And as much as they are a reflection of who I am, like in the sense that they care for people so much, I tend to put other people and their needs and feelings like before me, like ahead of myself. Whereas I think Jude really understood that humans are better when we're part of a team and we're helping out. And so the change for them to create like a safe space in the local library was, it just kind of came easily to them because, they were a force, and they just really understand that life is better when we are working together to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I love how that starts off with like an idea of things that we need or we want to see, and then like the then follow through to like make it happen, I think was probably the most um hopeful to me, especially in the middle grade space, because I feel like a lot of times I have many ideas, but like my follow through is not there. So I don't know if I could be doing anything like this, honestly. Um, the next question I have is for In Tomorrow Doesn't Come and Bianca Torre is Afraid of Everything. Family and support systems, friends, found family are really crucial. And I was wondering if you both could talk about your family characters and how it was to create them for your books. And were your main characters' families the same in every draft I wrote? Justine, do you want to start?
Yeah, I would say it was really important to me to have a support system for Bianca. I think, I'm writing it's a murder mystery. So they're dealing with a lot of other dark things. And I didn't want their coming out to be a negative experience. It was something that I wanted to explore, like the positives and the love of and the friendship that comes along with building that support system and community. So it was a very important thing for me to focus on that. At the same time, there are familial characters that maybe won't have the best reaction, but aren't necessarily the ones that Bianca lets in during the limited time they're able to explore their gender in the book. And I think it was kind of important to me to have both of those aspects where there's not necessarily anything negative, but it also is completely valid to choose um, who you want to come out to or, let in the sense. And when you do, and that it's okay if at the end of the book or the end of your high school career or whatever time it is, if you don't have a giant coming out to everyone, and if you choose the support system that works for you and that you really want to let in. So I think that was something I was sort of working on from the first draft, and I don't think those aspects of the characters really changed that much. I think Bianca's family is pretty standard. Or like they didn't change too much throughout the drafts, but I think kind of having that juxtaposition of you could have parents that really support you in some ways without necessarily knowing that they'll support you in every way. And it's not necessarily based off of my own experience with my parents, but it was still something that I wanted to include in the book.
Yeah, for me, I think so. My main character, Avery, is someone who puts a lot of pressure on herself and is really scared of disappointing people. I think from a really early age, she struggles with depression and is suppressing things about herself for much of her life. And almost as a mask, she overperforms. Like her whole thought process is if she's doing really well at school and in sports and like is killing it at church, then like nobody's going to notice that like deep down she's really suffering and feels like a broken person. And of course, the people she most doesn't want to be disappointed in her are her parents. And they also sort of represent home and her belief system, Catholicism, up until she starts to question it and question herself. So it's really like, how does she fit into that world? Does she fit into that world? And is there a world they can still love her and have her fit in, but as her true self? And I think it's funny, like up until like my very most recent draft of edits, the parents I think felt a little bit flat. And I don't really know why, but I had a hard time writing them until my editor was like, okay, this draft really tried to focus on them and like, who are they and what are they feeling? And just the way that my life worked out, I was expecting to be a parent around that time. And so I think finally it was easier for me to put myself in their shoes. And I hope maybe that comes across on the page somehow. But even though they were such a big part of the story, I didn't really feel them until like the final drafts. But yeah, similarly, I've had many drafts with many different versions of the family. And I really love the final one I ended up with. So, but there used to be two brothers. There's just too many characters. There's a lot that's not on the page now.
Yeah, and I loved kind of what you were saying earlier, Justine. I really loved also how supportive both of your like families are, especially because the situations that you all put your families in are not necessarily everyday situations. Like it's a little bit of more of a stretch to be, on your best of days, right? Like supportive when it's like these also external forces, which are kind of like a curveball, honestly, in the things that you would imagine might happen to you and your family necessarily. Um, and then I would love to chat. I really am loving verse books, kind of just in general. I've always really loved them, but recently I've been loving them even more. And so I want to talk in the Song of Us about the verse structure. If you could walk us through drafting, writing, editing process in terms of the section titles and content. I really love the section titles, or I don't know if they are like chapters, because with verse stuff everything is like the chapter isn't necessarily as long as you might expect in a different type of book. And yeah, I'm just utterly like fascinated by all things verse. So yeah, if you could just walk us through kind of the process for constructing that.
Sure. I should start by saying that I don't think I'm a model for how to write a verse book because this is my first verse book. When I envisioned the Song of Us, it was May of 2020, and so there was a lot in the world that was really unclear. And I had this idea for this book, and for whatever reason, I was like, it's got to be Orpheus and Eurydice. It's got to be seventh grade. It's got to be two girls. It's got to be in verse. And I had never written a verse novel before, and it seemed so wild to me. Um, but I was in grad school at the time, and I think part of being in a program was encouraging myself to take risks. So I decided to try it. The very first draft of the Song of Us um, was an exercise in simply trying to tell myself the story. It was about 30,000 words by the time it was finished. And when I got to my last semester in grad school, I sat down with Jason Reynolds, who was my mentor, and he said to me, "This the language here is beautiful. You need about half of it." And so that was when I went from really drafting a story to revising into poetry. And so it became about how do I get in and out of every poem? How do I find the heart of every poem? And how do I remove everything else? That, like, a verse novel moves and sings when the author pays attention to every word. And it is a wonderful, wild exercise. It was such an invitation for my brain to play. Like, as a kid, I loved word puzzles and like rebuses. I loved this idea that you could say so much with so little. And in creating this book, I discovered that actually I think it accessed a lot of the puzzle parts of my brain because it was about like, how do you tell a story with like half of what you normally have? So, when I finished what the draft that I then went and got an agent with, it was about 16,000 words. When we got my editor, she was like, "Okay, you could give us like a little bit more. Like, I understand that you really worked on sparse verse, but like we could have a little bit more." And so it ended up being around 20,000 words. But I think about the process so much of the way that a sculptor takes a huge block of marble and just chisels and chisels and chisels until all that is left is exactly what you need and nothing else. Um, and the titles, again, with poetry, I think in telling a story through poetry, you get this opportunity. Do I want to use this title to situate us in a space or in a time, or in a feeling or in the moment? And scenes often become 5 or 6 poems. So how do you decide where is that break? Where is that pause? And sometimes it's like because the character needs a pause, or sometimes it's because you want a feeling to land in a certain way. And so it's really about looking at every page and thinking, like, what is the maximum I need here or the minimum I need here and nothing else?
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, because I really appreciated how you balance also like dialogue versus introspection. Because in a different type or different way, formatting of novel, you can have a lot more dialogue, right? Because you have a lot more words. um, and so I loved how you balance that.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm really struggling with in my second book is because I'm finding myself really gravitating towards dialogue. And I think it's actually in poetry, it can slow it down too much. It can drag it in a way that I don't actually want my poems to drag. Something I love and I see a lot of people love in poetry novels is that they move. So, like, how do you have just the most important moments and trust your reader to know the rest? You can trust the reader to infer a whole lot more. And I think sometimes middle grade authors worry that 12-year-olds are not going to pick up on a lot, but I taught middle school for 5 years, and they pick up everything. They pick up 10 times more than you want them to. And so, like, I trust my readers a lot to get what they need from it.
I'm muted. Sorry. I I have an improv question, which hopefully will inspire other people to ask questions if they have any. But my improv question, I want to know kind of what you were making me think of. You were making me think of titles, and so I want to know more about everyone else's titles because I love so much. It's such a deep, like profound sense of satisfaction I have when I can recognize, you see a title in the book or like you get that like connection. You're like, "Oh, that makes sense." So I want to know about the titles, especially cuz they can also change throughout drafting too. So, um Caroline, you want to start?
Skating on Mars has always been skating on Mars, because Mars always was really into David Bowie. um, so it's a play on the song Life on Mars by David Bowie. Mars's father in the book is a Bowie fan, and that's a connecting point for them when they're thinking about their father. And I get a lot of questions from young people about, so does your book take place on Mars? And why is it about being on Mars? And so apologies for the confusion and disappointment when children pick up my book and go, does not take place on Mars. Why is this making me cry? But once I figured out, like, it was just sort of like a pithy title that worked with those two elements that I knew were, Mars's name, ice skating, David Bowie. Okay, end of list. What, crunch it together, skating on Mars, we'll go with that. And I guess I was sort of waiting for my agent or my editor or the marketing people to be like, let's rethink, but no one has. So haha, joke's on you, everyone. I love my title.
The Song of Us was not named The Song of Us when I queried it or when I wrote it. It was always named O and E. And because it was an Orpheus and Eurydice story, and also because in grad school I was told that it was very likely I would not have any control over my titles, I decided very early on that I just wasn't going to get attached. And so naming my book O and E felt like I was connecting it back to the original story that inspired it, while also totally giving over to the fact that somebody else was probably going to name my book for me. And when my editor and I landed on The Song of Us, it was a lot. It was a lot of back and forth because I wanted something that involved both of them. One of the things that the original story does is it really only focuses on Orpheus's story. And I wanted to know, what did Eurydice do down there? Like, what was she doing? She wasn't just waiting for Orpheus to show up. And so, this book is dual point of view. And I really wanted Eden to have her full story. And so we landed on The Song of Us because it both honors the fact that it's about both of them, and that, one of them loves poetry and one of them loves music. And together, that's very much a song.
For me, I don't really know if I have had any other like working titles. I know I landed on Jude Tries to Save the World pretty early in the early draft, and was talking about it with a friend of mine, and she was like, "How is working on like how is Jude Saves the World going?" And I was like, "Oh, that's a better title." So I actually I dropped the Jude Tries to Save the World, and I went with Jude Saves the World. And yeah, I was kind of expecting it to change during like the querying process or the publishing process, and yeah, it just stuck, and I'm really happy that it did because I think that it reflects Jude's character very well.
Yeah, Bianca Torre is Afraid of Everything was also the title from the first draft, so that one didn't change. I think the only time I called it something else was when I was first outlining, and it was Lesbian Sheep Outline, and that was like what I had titled it. But then from the first draft, the list of fears that Bianca sort of keeps track of was always a big part of the book. So to make it easier on myself, I just kind of came up with a name using their first name, last name, and the fact that they are basically afraid of everything. And it ended up just fitting very well. So I think that's why we just kept it throughout the entire publication process.
Yeah, for me, my book was called Stars and Other Lights for a very, very long time. And sort of the meaning behind that is just the little pin drops of light, in a really dark sky. Of course, referencing the asteroid as well, but really throughout the book, the flashback chapters were not chronological as they are now. They were sort of just vignettes throughout her life, and each one was titled with a different light that kind of appears in that chapter, whether it's fireflies or fireworks. And there's still some of that in the book, but we totally the titles aren't there anymore. But I changed it. I did the Pitch Wars program back in 2019, and my mentors Kelly Quinlan and Adrian Tooley were like, "Listen, we got just in our submissions like 20 different books with stars in the name, and agents are probably going to have that same experience, and you want it to stand out. So let's think about what we could do to change it." And I had a lot of like angst around it. Not that I was sad to see it go, but I just couldn't really think of something that incorporated everything I wanted to say about the book and still sounded like YA. And it was a New Year's Eve, which for them is a high holiday because they're Virgos. But we were just reading through different poems together, like over chat. And there's this poem called The Conditional by Ada Limon, who's one of my absolute favorite poets. And the very first line is, "Say tomorrow doesn't come." And then towards the end of the poem, if you've read the book, and I had, of course, like already had my full draft at this point, the end of the poem says, "Say we spend our last moments staring at each other, hands knotted together, clutching the dog, watching the sky burn. Say it doesn't matter. Say that would be enough. Say you'd still want this, us alive right here, feeling lucky." And it's almost like you would think that I had read that poem first and then wrote the book. So I just referenced the first line, and it just felt very fitting, and it has made it through to publication. So I'm very happy with it.
I want to know what has been the most rewarding or exciting part of the debut process so far, leaving it open for many more exciting and rewarding things to happen in the future. Kate, do you want to start?
Sure. First and foremost, it has been meeting the other fabulous people that are in this group right now has truly made the experience delightful. Um, and such an adventure. It's so great to share it with other people. But there's one other person that I'm sharing it with too, which is my older sister who's debuting in October with her adult novel, The Invisible World. And it's been really special to have a debut experience with my sister as well. It is not something that either one of us expected. And we write really differently. And we've certainly had a different experience getting there. But I'm so grateful that I get to connect with other people, both in my family and in my found debut family. It has made all the difference for me.
My answer for this question is the same. It's the friendships that I've made with everybody in this panel. Because we're all debuting with queer Kidlit, we can, cheer each other on and also hold space for the hard stuff too, which I really appreciate and I'm very grateful for. And also just seeing my support system and how much they believe in me. Like, I just got a message while we're in this panel that my mom finally finished reading Jude Saves the World. And like, she just has been so supportive my entire life with my writing career, and being able to, share this part of me with her has also been just really rewarding. And yeah, I just feel really lucky and grateful for the people that I have in my life who are my support system.
Yeah, I think the most rewarding thing for me has been to hear from, at least at this point, early queer and especially non-binary readers that, sorry if you hear a cat, but that have really connected to Bianca and have shared that Bianca's gender experience and gender journey really made them feel like seen, and that they just like really enjoyed reading it and also thought it was funny. That's a very like cool thing to hear as well. So yeah, just the support from queer book influencers and booksellers and librarians, even before release, has just meant the absolute world, especially because it is kind of scary to put yourself out as a queer author, in the current climate, and to just have that support and know that people are reading it and that it means something to them, makes everything worth it.
Yeah, no, 100% the people, like the people who read my earliest drafts through this group who's been super supportive of me and someone I can like share this experience with has like changed my life and changed me, I think, as a person. And it's just been like a really like some of the best people in the whole world I found through my book, not even just like the traditional publishing part of it, but before that. And like having somebody who reads your work, especially when it's so personal and sees you and sees themselves in it, like that's a bond like no other. Like it's just such a really moving experience. And like my book's pretty long. Anyone who's taken the time to read it, even if they didn't like it, I feel really grateful that they spent that time with me. And gave me a chance and tried to see me. I think the other piece of it for me is like I came pretty close to self-publishing my book, and I still think like that would have been a valid route for it, and I think it would have found a much smaller audience, but maybe some people who needed it or were seeking books that cover mental illness, especially for queer characters. But the cool thing about traditional publishing, at least for me, is that like I know 100% I pushed this book as far as I could push it. And there were people there to help me along the way who are very good at what they do. And so like whenever I feel like down about the book or I start to question it, I just remind myself like I gave it everything I had, in terms of like what I had to give at this point in my life and who I am. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's the best that I had in me. And I really like gave it everything I had. And that makes me really proud.
Echoes to everybody in terms of meeting folks and connecting with other writers in particular. But the thing I'll add is for me, writing was really solitary early on. I started writing books for real, whatever that means. When my child was born, I'm a single parent and I needed some sort of creative outlet. And I couldn't go to rehearsal or I couldn't go to the art studio because I needed to stay home with my child. So I started writing books, and it was creative, but it was also lonely. So I think what has been really wonderful about the debut experience is taking something that's been, an individual activity for so long and having it move into a collaborative space. So going through like the editing process with my wonderful editor, Rachel Dybel, having like the cover. I still like freak out in excitement about the whole process of someone making art based on what you've written, and then that and then going through multiple drafts and being like, let's tweak the colors here, let's do the font here. Like that was such a magical experience to be, one of the members of the team of that cover, not the talent necessarily at all. So I think being able to understand the more collaborative side of publishing has been really great.
Okay, I want to end on one question, mostly because I just really want to know. So I'm sorry in advance to everyone who might have to go. But the question that I want to ask is, what were your favorite queer friendships in books, and or any piece of media at all, right? Like TV shows, films, music, etc. Anything really. I just want like this to be just chock full of recommendations for people. Ronnie, do you want to start?
Sure. So I'm gonna have to say the friendships in Schitt's Creek for any piece of media. I just love that they might not necessarily be all canonically queer, but for me, like their love for one another and their found family, it just very much echoes, I think, a queer experience. So that would definitely be my number one recommendation. It's just great.
I feel like I am just like forgetting every piece of media that I've ever watched. But one thing, even though both characters aren't necessarily queer, is the friendship in the half of it. I think really was something that spoke to me a lot and even like inspired my writing because I do love writing about friendships. And so that was, just a queer movie that like I really loved, and especially like in the YA space. So that's something that really stands out as like a fun sort of like friendship story while still showing like the challenges that you could have, especially with teenage friendships.
Yeah, I think for me, one of my absolute favorites is The Friendship in We Deserve Monuments by Jazz Hammonds. At the center of the book, Avery has two new friends, Jade and Simone, and Jazz is a friend of mine. I've read that book many times, but I was listening to the audiobook more recently and I was like bawling. I'm like, I know this story, but just something about the chemistry between the characters and just like the way that they love each other, like makes you love the characters in the exact same way. And it's super moving and it's a lot of fun. And I think that book's really emotional and deals with some heavy topics. But the relationships and the friendships even too, like with her grandmother who's like super funny, so like the friendships even within her family, just like Jazz's character dynamics are incredible and just some of my absolute favorite. And it reminded me like what I loved about the book the first time I read it, and also what I really inspired me for my own writing, because I feel like that like the plot matters, but how you feel while you're reading it and how you're connecting with the characters perhaps matters more for me.
Last summer was a wonderful opportunity for everyone to dine on a wonderful buffet of queer television. And my back to back, I got to do Our Flag Means Death and A League of Their Own. And I like can't wait for more of them. Please renew A League of Their Own, Amazon Prime, for more than 4 episodes. But I think in particular, having so many queer characters in both of those shows was like it was like a exhilarating zip through my spirit.
I also had this moment where I was like, I don't know if I've ever seen any queer media in my whole life, which is obviously not true, but the question threw me. And all I could think about was Drag Race because that is 99% of my life outside of books. But aside from Drag Race, the queer friendships in One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston are amazing. There's like obviously the main romance between the two characters is so fabulous, but also just the many queer side characters. I feel like Casey McQuiston does a great job of creating secondary characters that clearly have their own arcs, their own lives, their own they get to be the main characters at other places, I'm sure of it. And I feel like they just capture so well the variety that can exist in queer friendships.
Yeah, as I was listening to everyone's answers, I realized that like I also don't really have an answer to this question. I didn't think ahead of it in case I had to answer it. But I agree. Like I think that I just keep hearing about more and more things, or I feel like maybe I'm just in like an echo chamber where basically I only really hear about queer recommendations for things, or it's like I've never heard of this show, but I've heard that one of the characters is queer, so I think I should probably watch it, even though like it never would have made it to my radar otherwise. um Thank you so much to everyone for chatting, for the people who are watching in the chat. I've left everyone's bookshop.org links in the description box below, so definitely visit those, add them to your TBR if you have not read them. Just add them basically. Do everything with all the links basically. And yeah, thank you so much to the authors for chatting with me, and I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.